Afternoon, Matt.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two psychotherapists talk about all things about relationships, particularly in the modern world. Today, Matt, we're going to be talking about the issue of control in relationships and potentially even as far as, would you say, emotional abuse within relationships. I want us as part of this conversation to kind of tease out the difference and maybe hark back to some conversations we've had about the overuse of certain terms in relationships and the differentiation between that and proper kind of control and abuse within relationships.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the borderline between those things, aren't we? When sometimes a partner, I don't know, is disrespectful towards us, and we need to speak up for that, and we need to reset things to the other end of the extreme when you're being, I don't know, dominated in like multiple domains of your life, and it's probably time to leave. So I think, as with everything, there's a continuum, huh?
It's fair to say, though, that there is a lot of this in relationships, probably more than our listeners might think that there is in society more generally. It's a slightly unspoken thing. We don't talk to our friends usually when we're in difficult relationships where there might be control or potential emotional abuse in them.
Yeah,
You had some statistics that you'd found to kind of give us an indication of maybe how prevalent some of this is.
Yeah, so I think I was quite surprised by that. So estimates suggest something like 1.4 million women and three-quarters of a million men in the UK experienced some form of abuse. That was in the year ending 2023, so fairly recent estimates. So big numbers, and I think what I was surprised by in that number is just how many men are in that sort of position as well. So
Yeah.
it's gonna then rest on what you mean by some form of abuse, isn't it? Like what are we talking about there? So I mean that definition is broader than would meet, for example, a legal criminal test. But like that's what people are experiencing, and that I suppose is really what the article is about. It's not about what would enable you to bring a criminal case or what constitutes action under the law. It's more like what does it get like in an average relationship if somebody starts throwing their weight around on spending decisions and tends to book everything and control the diary and whatever else. Does that start to tip into feeling like this is a less than brilliant, fulfilling, fair relationship?
I think it's fair, and you draw this out in the article that we'll put in the show notes for the episode, that it's rare that one element of your relationship would be exposed to this kind of control. It tends to be, if you're with a controlling partner, they'll tend to want to exert that control in different aspects of your life, be it financial or being clear about which friends you can't see or where you need to be at certain times, those kind of things. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, when we maybe as we step through this,
Yeah.
we're identifying like five or so things to watch out for. And I think if those things stack up, you've got a problem on your hands, and it's probably time to leave. Maybe talking to people you trust and thinking about how to do that, safely and not waiting for things to escalate. But for a lot of people, there'll be an aspect of each of those things that they maybe want to address or do differently rather than they want to end the relationship.
One of the, before we get to those five areas of control that you either or potential control that you highlight, let's step through some of those historical examples. Some of them quite surprising, some of them quite maybe potentially darkly funny as well. Talk us through them. We presented them partly to give people an indication that this can happen even with people that you don't expect it to be happening with, right? So
Yeah.
uh, classically great men with a capital G, a capital M from history. Some of
Yeah.
them were involved in some pretty horrible behaviors. And the idea, of course, is that then, some people in your life who you might not anticipate acting like that can be pretty horrible to their partners behind closed doors.
Yes, it's old as the hills, isn't it? I think controlling a relationship, it's always been around. And the examples we picked out, there's a sort of semi-famous letter from Einstein to his wife. So we think of him as a sort of, I don't know, genial, nutty professor.
Yeah, totally. He's in adverts all the time. Now that the trademarks run out, the copyright on his image, he's on all of the modern adverts as this crusty old lovable uncle type, isn't it? Mad
Yeah,
professor.
Yeah, very, very much so. But actually, like his note to his wife, you will serve me 3 meals a day in my room. You'll stop talking to me if I request it. You'll leave the room immediately when I ask. All of those sorts of things like show a different side to him. He wrote that note all the while having an affair with his cousin as well. So not such a nice guy, not so cuddly in terms of the relationship. And as the other couple of examples were Gandhi, who seen by most people as a peace icon. I'm sure my boys have recently done a school project on his role and impact in the world, but some pretty unpleasant views on women, and crystal clear evidence that he withheld medical care and treatment from his wife right up until the end. Where medication given may well have extended her life, and then people like Tolstoy, who's a bit more, if you know much about him and his history of his relationship, he's a bit more sort of out there anyway, so maybe less surprising. But in the book of letters from his wife Sophia, he's described as a monster in the introduction to that he's a bad and inconsiderate husband and a monster, in fact. So I think all of those things. There's Charles Dickens as well was the other one, wasn't it? Maybe we mention him too, because he's so cuddly and lovable, on record as humiliating his wife post-pregnancy for her weight gain, and then when they eventually separate, tried to have her institutionalized. So not quite the figure you think you maybe know from various TV adaptations.
Great. So in the first 10 minutes of this episode, you demolished the reputation of four of probably the personal heroes of great many of our congratulations. One of the things that you were really surprised by in the stats that you mentioned earlier was the amount of men who feel like they've been controlled or emotionally abused in a relationship. You've just mentioned 4 or 5 case studies of historical figures. They're all men. It's clear, obviously, though, that this doesn't just apply to men, or just doesn't apply to history, that you've got some contemporary examples too.
Yeah, so I mean, the examples from sort of history, literature, myth would be things like Delilah, cutting Samson's hair. Lady Macbeth still gets referred to a lot, doesn't it? Lady Macbeth, that somebody, particularly around like our old trade in politics, like a wife in the background is often, described in that way, and sometimes specifically with that kind of moniker. But yeah, there are obviously those sorts of accounts, as we say in the article, are tend to be relayed back through a male dominated, male influenced lens. But there are just too many modern examples. The statistic that we talked about earlier suggests that like men are on the receiving end of this as well. And then we just picked out some recent examples of women who had, for example, lied about their health, saying things like they had cancer, tricking boyfriends out of thousands of pounds. These are documented court cases that ended up in prosecution. One case that we talk about there was ranged over 20 years, ended up in a 4-year custodial sentence. So quite serious sorts of things. And really, I mean, those cases that end up in prosecution are obviously much more extreme than the kind of everyday instances that we're principally referring to. But they're controlling people's sort of access to the toilet and crazy stuff like that. So I think it's sort of undeniable that stuff goes on in a relationship. I think there are too many examples from history, too many examples of recent court cases, and too many examples of women doing that to men to suggest it just tilts one way. It's a potential in any relationship.
Let's try and help our listeners understand how this might be relevant to them, though, because I imagine a lot of them might be thinking, well, nothing like that has ever happened to me. That's at the extreme end of thing. I've never had a partner write me a note telling me they've got to serve me 3 meals a day in my room at a set time or control my access to the toilet. Like, what are the 5 signs that or 5 questions almost that you'd want people to think about when thinking about whether they're being subject to any kind of inappropriate control in their relationship?
Yeah. So just before doing that, maybe like one comment around the researchers and academics who study coercive control point out that it can feel a lot like love. So I think
Yeah, yeah.
that's my link, really. The crazier stuff feels just crazy, and you'd probably know to leave a relationship if you were on the receiving end of a note like that. But often control can feel like love because it can start small. It can therefore be hard to spot. And I think the main point is it sort of comes disguised as control. It comes disguised as care.
I'm
And
only doing this because I care about you.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
only controlling your money because you're bad with money and I want to make sure that you're spending it well. That sort of thing.
yeah, exactly right. And the other point they make is that these kind of controlling behaviors usually take place in a relationship which isn't all bad. So it would be
Yeah.
so much easier to cast somebody as a monster, to say you picked the wrong person, and all of these things were present all the time in every interaction. But that just turns out not to be true either. So there genuinely is care and concern in the mix, but there is also control. And what we're trying to encourage people to do is, I suppose, just reflect deeply, look carefully at those things. If there's a feeling that you're being sort of dominated, it's worth going to those sorts of questions. And the examples we pick out, the first one was things like teasing or joking about sensitive topics. So things like, I don't know, your partner's intelligence or your partner's weight or something. So framed as jokes, often, sometimes said in company, but can be quite undermining and eroding of trust. If someone is minimizing your achievements and sort of putting you down, um, that is probably closer to being belittled than it is to playful teasing.
Yeah. Bit of plausible deniability there, isn't there? Or particularly
There is, yeah,
if you
yeah.
get called out on it, it was only a joke. I didn't realize you were so sensitive. Stop being so sensitive. It then becomes almost pushed back on you.
Yeah, I agree, and on its own, maybe don't know what you do with that, right? You might ask for it to stop, you might ask for it to be toned down, might not be enough on its own, and that's I think the way these things are additive or kind of stack up.
Okay.
The second
Yeah.
one is around monitoring communication, so sort of constantly asking to see messages or checking a call history, questioning who you're speaking to, and in the end it probably masks a kind of distrust. Healthy relationships built on mutual respect and observing boundaries. Your partner can express their view that they don't particularly like you having contact with somebody, but they're not in the business of ordering you not to, right? Invading your privacy or making your decisions for you. So conversation could be had about who you're in contact with, whether you still follow your exes on social media, but that is a conversation rather than a series of demands, and somebody wanting your phone, wanting access to your phone, wanting to look through in that way. Lots of couples do share that, are open about that, but I think there is a real risk there when one person is overbearing. You come across that much in your work with couples or individuals?
Yes, I think one way it comes through in my work is I'm consistently surprised by how many people do check their partner's phone when their partner is not there.
Yeah.
I think that's slightly different to what we're talking about here, whereas you're talking about almost demanding it. But I think there is sometimes the kind of hidden elements of control that stem from a deep insecurity that maybe play into what we're talking about as well. A lot of
Yeah.
people who feel guilty after the fact, but yeah, kind of check their partner's phone because they think there's something going on, and they so there's a control element there, but more implicit control.
Yeah, no, it's a good example. I think that's exactly the territory I'm thinking in. That it's that sliding scale, thin end of the waves. There's a subtlety to this, isn't there?
Mm, mm.
I think that the third one we talk about is excessive checking in. So it would be quite ordinary, wouldn't it, to check where your partner was, particularly if they're running late, but constant texts to check their whereabouts end up just feeling more like surveillance. And then the darker side of that, I think, if there's a sort of meltdown or a sulk or a massive emotional response in relation to getting stuck at work or getting caught late or hanging on for a second drink when you said you'd go for one, that those things feel like they've tipped into control. And I think this was what, when we were talking before we put the article through to Psychology Today, you were pressing for a bit more on this, that more generally, if a partner constantly reacts to conflicts with that kind of meltdown, whether it's a panic attack, crying fit, or, you know, kind of withdrawal to another room, not talking, that in itself is a form of control.
I think the way I expressed it was kind of control through fragility. This idea of everyone has to, and particularly someone's romantic partner has to tread on eggshells around them all the time. That constant feeling of their emotional needs are the most important thing in the relationship. That I need to go home after one drink, even though I want to stay for two, because if I do stay for two, even though I know that I want to, I'm going to piss off my partner and upset them.
Yeah.
I can't deal with their meltdown when I get home. I don't want to have to deal with them. It's easy. You hear this quite a lot, right? It's easier not to go there. It's just I want the easier life. But if you're making those easy decisions every day, potentially multiple times a day, it's worth kind of questioning whether someone is just controlling through fragility, basically.
Yeah, good. I mean, I thought there was lots to explore in this one, and I think you see a fear there, don't you? I've must have had this example like 100 times of somebody who's been out for work and then one drink has turned into two or sometimes more, and how much the other partner hates that. And there is a discourtesy in there, isn't there? If you're not texting to say, I know I said I'd be back so we could eat together, but do you mind if I stay on, or I'm going to stay on this, you know? And often the text hasn't got sent because there's a fear of the reaction. There's a fear of what you're going to get back on the other end. You're going to be told not to. You're going to be called names. It's going to ruin the kind of nice vibe that you've got going on. And there's a lot to be said about that example. But one thing to be said is that feels to me towards the unreasonable end of the spectrum.
I agree. I
You
agree.
could be fed up. You could be disappointed that you were going to have dinner together and you haven't seen each other that much this week. But a meltdown, a kind of, you know, some sort of hissy fit, maybe just point out what's going on, try and find an alternative time, say, yeah, sure, but can we catch up tomorrow? There are a whole, it is easier said than done, but there are a whole host of responses to that, which are just much more productive, I think.
I agree.
And then I guess number 4 was an extension of that to some extent, using guilt and manipulation. So perhaps discouraging you from spending time with family and friends because you claim the partner is claiming that they're a bad influence, or that you're neglecting your romantic relationship by doing so, by spending time with your family and friends. So things like, I'm just looking out for you, or if you really cared about us, or if you really put this relationship first, you would, etc., etc. And I think you can feel that, you can notice that as pressure if it's leading you to make decisions that you're not comfortable with, or sacrifices that you're not comfortable with. So if you really don't go and catch up with your mates because you're worried about that, or you duck out of invites and events or whatever it is, you probably can get in touch with, that's not such a great thing that we've baked into this relationship, that I'm going to get made to feel guilty for doing something with friends and family.
Yeah, well, the way you've described it is more explicit. There's an implicit punishment, isn't there, that might get manifested in variety of different ways, whether it's I think we go on to talk about kind of using sex in a certain way, but sex is a kind of classic way as well. I'm just going to withdraw physically from you. I'm not going to vocalize it. I'm not going to explicitly make you feel guilty, but I'm going to find ways to punish you, just little ways of just withdrawing my affection or holding it against you or whatever it might be. That these much more subtle, manipulative ways can come out through relationships.
Yeah, no, it's a good example. And the sort of silent treatment when you come back
Yeah.
from an event or from
Yeah.
seeing
And
so
even the denial, right? That no, I'm not angry. I'm not angry. But you can just, that
yeah.
person is just giving it off. Like, I'm going to punish you, but I'm going to, again, retain that deniability to some degree. I'm not punishing you, but I'm going to punish you.
And then the final one before we talk about what you might do if you're up against those circumstances is, if you're in a relationship where one person tends to make all of the decisions, they tend to decide where to eat, what to watch, how to spend money, you know, and don't really give your preferences much thought or concern, or, you know, downgrade your preferences or tell you why it was a bad idea. I think money's quite a good one. Sometimes there is somebody in the relationship who kind of owns the spreadsheets. That bit for me is okay. That one person opts out of talking about money or is irresponsible about money is not okay. And the owner of the spreadsheets does not get to cross question the other person on every spending decision under the kind of guise of it being about budgeting or saving or whatever else, if they're, picking up on smaller items of spend that maybe should have already been agreed as discretionary. If somebody's really bearing down in that area of life, I think can feel like far too much.
That one feels like it occupies a slightly separate space, in that a lot of what you've described earlier as signs of control feel like they're quite adolescent, in the sense of adolescent insecurity and adolescent jealousy, trying
Yeah,
to
yeah.
control whose emotion, where your partner's emotional energy goes, and potentially guarding against the threat of infidelity, for example. I don't want you seeing certain male friends if you're a female partner or whatever, or
Yeah, or going out with friends who are single, who've got a reputation.
exactly. There's a certain kind of new attractive guy in the office that you don't want your partner to go on a drink with, or something like that, right? It feels like it's about your own jealousy and insecurity. What do you think's going on with that kind of financial control of decisions? There's a dominance or power involved in that one that seems slightly different to some of the others.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's maybe a bit darker, isn't it? In some respects. Not sure this is the answer to your question, but I think it's quite commonplace that one person does lead on the money, and
Yeah.
then that sort of bakes in the problem, doesn't it? I think in all of these examples, there's somebody pushing, so to speak, but there's also somebody, I don't know, stepping back or not resisting that, because much of the answer to this is, I don't really like this. I don't really care for this. This doesn't feel quite
Yeah.
right. So even though these things can feel a bit, I don't know, darker or more unpleasant to talk about, I think they can all be named and noticed. And I think it's an interesting question that you pose. My approach with couples is, does it matter where it comes from? Some of these things, like, does it matter if there's a long tail of this, or we can get to the bottom of it, or we can establish it really was something that was missing in childhood or that went wrong for you? There is also an action in the present day. If you are a controlling person, stop controlling your partner. Find a way to stop, find a way to get help and do something about that. And if you're on the receiving end of it, there is an onus on you to speak up, to notice it, and to say, I am not loving this, or I am on the cusp of leaving if this doesn't change.
Well, what about, I agree with all that. What about the person who comes back and says, I don't like it, but I think it's coming from a place of love? You see that quite a lot. They're almost like the defense of the partner and the protection of the partner. If you were speaking to a client or a friend, how would you help them to move through that to somewhere else?
It probably takes us to the final section of the article, doesn't it? The final section of
Yeah.
this conversation, I guess, the sort of should you stay or should you go question. And I think, first off, the meta skill for almost anything is noticing, isn't it? Like recognizing those behaviors as the critical first step. Like noticing anything that's going on is going to be the first way to change it. And I suppose I would say, taken together, those things represent an imbalance of power, and you probably need to take an action. And as we said before, that might be talking to somebody you trust and then making a plan to leave. I think if you recognize those behaviors in yourself, you really do need to do something about
Take a step back though, Matt, because I think it's really important to double down on that idea that you might be in a relationship where what began as a feeling of as feeling like love has become intensive control, and you might be in a situation where you're convincing yourself that you're in a deeply loving relationship that is actually more problematic. And for you to be inviting people or encouraging people to think maybe that is going on in your life, I think is a really important part of that noticing meta skill you're talking about. Because there might be people listening to this who are starting from a place of, actually, I think this is coming from a place of love, that this conversation might help them stand back from that and say, hang on a minute, maybe I need to think about that behavior in a different way.
Yeah, you're saying there, like, that's maybe worth pausing on, stacking those things.
Reinforcing that idea, because if you don't notice it, you don't get any further on the path, right? So the key part of the sequence is noticing. And what
Yeah.
we're saying earlier on in this conversation is actually noticing can be really difficult. It sounds easy because obviously if someone's being an absolute arse to you, you should be able to notice that. But what tends to happen is that this starts from a kind of, she's doing that because she loves me. Drip, 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 drip. And then 10 years down the
Yes.
line, you're being controlled in every aspect of your life.
Yeah. And I
Worth
think that's why
stepping
we,
back from that.
sorry, no, you say.
No, I was done. You go.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's why we chose those quite subtle examples. So you're like joking and teasing with one another in company. Well, surely there's nothing wrong with that. We don't need to be po-faced and take ourselves so
Yeah,
seriously.
we're being playful about our own
And
imperfections. Why not?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And of course, I want to know like whether you're running late or whatever, because I'm preparing dinner for you. Like I'm the good guy here. I'm the nice guy, and I want to make sure this relationship goes the distance. So that if I'm asking any questions about who you're
yeah,
talking to, because I know that
yeah.
relationships around me and my friendship circle have broken up, and sometimes they break up because of too much contact with exes, etc., etc. We could go on. So I guess we're in a lather of agreement, aren't we, that those small things stack up within those headlines around jokes or putting somebody down. There's a job to do to be, I don't know, maybe a bit more forensic or put that under the microscope. Is it jokes on like across multiple topics? Is it about weight? Is it about intelligence? Is it about my achievements or my job? Doesn't matter. Am I constantly on the receiving end of that? There's that bit of research that we don't love, but we often refer to, that sort of 5 and 1, the compliments and appreciation to the sort of bit of feedback. And there's almost something similar going on here, isn't there? Is it 5 jokes to 1 compliment, or is it 1 sort of joke at your expense to 5 compliments? It doesn't need to be that precise, but there's something about the balance of all of those things. Somebody checking up on you and worrying where you are is very different from somebody constantly demanding the update.
Yeah. Good. So someone's noticed
Yeah.
that there's some troubling behavior, some controlling behavior. What next? What do they do?
So I think if those things really do stack up, it's across the piece, it's across sort of multiple domains of life. You're fixing to leave, aren't you? And you're doing that before things escalate too far.
So you're not challenging your partner. You're not asking your partner to.
I think when all of those things stack up, where we started on this was those kind of extreme cases, the crazy bit, the bit that leads to criminal behavior. I think if you've got a suite of information there, if you've got loads and loads of data points, and suddenly you're like, oh my goodness, this is happening here and here and here, then I think there's an argument for it's probably an occasion to leave, I suppose. But I think you're right. Maybe we've got that the wrong way round in the article. We start with you should leave if that's going on, but I think you would step through it more slowly in real time, wouldn't you? The minute you're noticing those things.
I guess I'm thinking though about people in my life who've been in genuinely controlling relationships where I just think that there's no going back from that. There is, you stay or you go. And I want my friends and loved ones in those situations to get out of those
Yeah,
relationships, because
yeah.
let's not be around the bush. They are
No,
awful relationships.
yeah. No, I'd agree. I'd agree. And I think if you've got all or some version of those 5 things going on, I mean, not a definitive list, those 5, but it's like, actually, that's a pattern of behavior, isn't it? I suppose for me, that's the distinction, that there's a pattern of behavior. But sometimes the other bit of it is that those behaviors do show up in an otherwise healthy relationship. If there's one of those areas where like somebody is a bit overbearing with money, but they're broadly kind to you, they don't make jokes at your expense, they don't always demand to know where you are, they're not fixated on your exes, you might say, here's the thing, none of us is perfect, but I'd like to speak up about this thing, because we know the selfish tendencies can creep into any relationship. We've all got that tendency to be a bit selfish, haven't we? You can simply explain to your partner, it's not necessarily easy, this, but it is sort of relatively straightforward. You would say to your partner, this action makes me feel this way, and I would like for it to change. And I think whether you're in a healthy relationship or a controlling one by the response you get to that. If they care about you, then they'll adjust that, right? Not such a big deal. The strength of the relationship and your feelings matter more than their preference for managing money or having, timed updates on your whereabouts. And if they won't, then you're probably back to where we start, which is it's time to reassess.
And part of what we're saying there is don't fall for the lie of the behavior is because they love you, because that will be the response a lot of the time. I'm only doing this because I love you, because of how deeply I care about you. And that can feel good, but don't fall for that lie.
Yeah. I think that's well put, and that's not, these things are always judgments, aren't they? There's always a subtlety to this, and I mean, I think that's the essence of that article. It's not always easy to spot these things. The academics and the researchers in this area say it looks and feels a lot like love. I think we're saying the same thing, aren't we? From the couples work we do, sometimes those things can have a degree of subtlety to them. And probably, only the person on the receiving end can really judge it. I think in most of the relationships that I see around me and admire, if somebody raises something that they really don't like, the other person has a right of reply. But that person saying they really don't like it is pretty important. It's pretty significant. Like, your minor preference to be a bit sort of teasy when you're out as a couple, if they don't love being teased for that thing, well, just cut it out.
Just quit it. Yeah.
That's
Good.
all. Yeah.
Any final thoughts on what someone should do if they recognize any of those behaviors?
No, I think I think we're saying if you're recognizing too many of them, really tough conversation with yourself about whether the relationship's right. And
Yeah.
I think take a deep breath and speak up for the things that are not going right in a relationship. That would sort of be my summary of relationship wisdom generally. You've got to speak up for the thing that you want. If you get constantly rebuffed on that, you're probably not with the right person.
And speaking up about it would involve ideally just talking from your perspective, right? I don't like it when, as opposed to you're doing something wrong, or you're being an asshole, or you're being too conforming.
Yeah. It's sort of when this happens, I feel like
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
and if you've got if you're really clear on what you want, then you're making a proposal, aren't you? Can we do it a bit differently? When you spend so much time with your friends, it makes me feel a bit neglected. Would it be okay if every other weekend we spend time doing this? Something along those lines. I mean, it's a bit trite when you say it, but I think that is the formulation that people can then hear. I get this. I know what we're referring to is specific. It's not an attack on me. It's telling me how you feel about a thing. And there's a bit of guidance as to what might work for you. And then you can make a more informed decision as to whether, yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable request. I'm happy to do that. Or we adjust it slightly. And then I think we're both, content to do that.
What do you imagine would have happened in the Einstein household if Mrs. Einstein had called up Albert out on his demand for 3 meals a day?
Yeah, well,
Screw you, Albert. You get 2 of them yourself.
I guess what happened in the Einstein household was it had gone by that point, right? He's having the affair.
Yeah. Get out while you still can, Mrs. Einstein.
It wasn't going to end well. Yeah. History's not been all that kind to her, and been very kind to him, hasn't it?
Indeed, which is what tends to happen in these examples.
Yeah.
Good. Let's finish it there. If you'd like to get in contact with us, we're at Crazy in Love Podcast UK at gmail.com. Leave us a review wherever you find this podcast. And if not, we will see you soon. Nice to see you, Matt.
Yeah, good to see you, Graham. Cheers.
Take care.